Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Travis Rieder. I will tell you all about Professor Rieder in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show which deals with the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership perspective, as you will definitely discover that Professor Rieder has some interesting insights into, you do it to bring people together for common cause. Welcome, Travis Rieder.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, I want to tell folks all about you. Travis Rieder is a bioethicist and moral philosopher at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, where he directs a Master of Bioethics degree program. And he's written on a bunch of topics. Today, his first book was about the ethical policies raised by pain and pain medication. And he himself had an experience with this after suffering a major accident, a motorcycle accident. And that led to him exploring the topic. Today, we're going to talk about a book with universal applications, and it has the exciting title of Catastrophe Ethics. Don't back off. It's a good topic. So welcome, Travis Rieder.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, I've been told that I must be really fun at parties. The titles of my books are In Pain and Catastrophe Ethics.
Oh yeah, what a hit, I'll see it. So anyway, the book Catastrophe Ethics is quite extraordinary. And we were talking in advance. And you have a model or I guess it's a model or a metaphor called the puzzle. And would you explain what the puzzle means in the context of catastrophic ethics?
Sure thing. Yeah. So here's a short paragraph. In a complex, globalized society of some 8 billion people acting in uncoordinated ways, the structure of the puzzle is reproduced everywhere. That doesn't mean it will look precisely the same in every context, but I think we should expect to find many instances of a general problem that has the following properties. 1, a massive harm threatens, which makes the moral stakes feel high. But 2, individuals are largely powerless to effect meaningful change. And so 3, this leads to passionate disagreement about what individuals are morally required to do.
So other than that, you're a great guest. So just laying on. The big problems of the world are intractable. Nothing we can do about it. We just move on. So that's great. So I want to kind of dive in because you have a simple metaphor for explaining the puzzle in simple terms, at least simple that I can understand. Tell us about the dining conundrum, about dining at a fine restaurant.
Yeah, so a lot of us have rules or principles or heuristics about what we eat. Whether you do, you probably know someone who's vegetarian or vegan or omnivorous or flexitarian or pescatarian or whatever. And so the idea here is a lot of people attach moral value to what we eat. And the reason is they don't want to do something. So if you ask a moral vegan why they're a vegan, they might say, well, I don't want to cause suffering of a sentient creature. I believe animals are sentient creatures. They can feel pain and pleasure. And so I don't want to have them tortured and killed so that I can consume them. So that all makes good sense. And there's a whole moral philosophical literature on it. But there's a problem because if we go out to a meal and we sit down and I'm sitting with my vegan friend and I order the most sort of ostentatious meat dish you can think of, a Tuscan steak, 1 kilo steak or something.
I'm getting hungry already.
Yeah. They might say, a cow had to die for you to eat that. You're going to contribute to more cows dying. And the challenge here is that while it is true that a cow had to die in order for me to eat it, the complex causal chain of animal agricultural systems through most parts of the world are so massive and so complex that they are insensitive to individual choice. And so suppose I decide, because my vegan friend is talking to me, okay, I shouldn't buy this steak. There will be no single animal that is not raised, harmed, and killed as a result of my choice. And so that is known as sometimes the problem of causal inefficacy or the problem of causal impotence. And the idea is I actually don't have the power to enact causal change in the way that I might want to with my individual actions.
Well, there's something further too. You talk about the spending power. So if I go to a fine restaurant and $200 or $300 meal, wouldn't it be better that I take that money and donate it to, a homeless shelter or a food program? But then you raise the other side of the equation. So
Yeah, absolutely. So, separate from the animal ethics literature, there's this very well-developed literature on charitable giving. It often says things like, hey, if you're going to go out to a nice meal, do you think that a nice meal is more important than saving lives overseas from people who are famished, impoverished, dying from easily preventable diseases? And most decent people say, of course not. Those things are more important. So they say, well, then you shouldn't spend $200 on a meal. You should not go out to that meal and send the $200 overseas to some famine relief organization. But here again, these organizations tend to be so big and so complex that yes, they soak up your money and they do things with them, but it is very rarely the case that you have the causal power to actually relieve someone's suffering.
okay. Well, we get into the topic then of ethics. And I love you have a quote from Mark Timmons, who has a book on moral theory called The Introduction. You say, the relation between moral philosophy and applied ethics is somewhat like the relation between pure science, physics, and engineering. So,
yeah, I love this. I love this quote because it embodies the way a lot of philosophers think about ethics, and I think is pretty clearly wrong, right? So the way in which it embodies the way that a lot of philosophers think about ethics is very often philosophers say, well, if I want to know what I should do in the world, then what I should do is actually go figure out like what the true moral philosophy is. And once I figured out the true moral philosophy, and there are a bunch of them to choose from, so maybe you say, well, the true moral philosophy is utilitarianism. Okay, good. Now I figured that out. Utilitarianism tells me to maximize the amount of pleasure.
Please go. Okay, thank you.
Minimize the amount of pain. No problem. And and so then I just have to go around and figure out like which actions maximize pleasure and minimize pain, and then I go out and do those things.
We have an uninvited guest right now. My 5-year-old grandson is visiting. So can you go with mom? Thank you. So how about that for an ethical choice for a grandfather?
Yeah, there you go. Well, you're just trying to maximize happiness, right?
Yeah.
And it was fun for me, so maximize my happiness too.
Yeah.
So what Mark Timmons says there is that a lot of philosophers think you figure out the true view and then you apply it to the real world. And so moral philosophy is a lot like physics, and applied ethics is like engineering, right? You go figure out the abstract truth and then you apply it to the world. What I argue in the book is that's just not the way we should do it at all. That you don't have to be a professional moral philosopher. You don't have to spend your entire life trying to figure out the grand truth of the universe. Instead, you just need to be conscientious and careful and thoughtful, and then we together can reason about these difficult questions.
Great. And interesting, as you said, the grand scheme of things, many people would have that understanding, and it's their purpose. Maybe it comes from their background, their faith, whatever it is. But I think you're talking about, and that's a lodestone for them and guides them. But the rest of us don't have to have that. It's what you're going to do on a daily basis. Was that true, Travis? So.
Exactly right. Yeah. We live in a deeply pluralistic society where, 8 billion people have 8 billion different views about the nature of reality and what's highest value, whether there's a God or not, whether there's an objective good or not. And it would really actually be quite awful if in order to make any moral progress, we had to determine who was right. Right. And so instead, what we should do is not worry about that. Leave that to the professional philosophers who are writing long philosophy books and abstract journal articles. And what we can do instead is we can talk to one another, and we can start from shared premises, identify shared values, and try to move forward carefully, logically, and in good faith.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we do live in a bifurcated world, certainly, and if we look at it on the political sense here in the States, and certainly in Europe, things like that, with different philosophies and approaches. And it's really hard for one side to hear another. And so often when we hear one side take an issue, if you don't know the appellation, if you don't know who's speaking, you could say, well, I'm not exactly sure what he or she is saying, but they're talking past one another. So how do we get past that, Travis? So.
Yeah, it's really part of the goal of this way of doing ethics is to not have that be an impediment at all. Now, I will say that it takes a really difficult starting point, a really difficult first step, because the first step is a sort of radical humility. The first step is acknowledging in a world with 8 billion approximate different moral views, it would take a pretty incredible amount of hubris to believe that I have the uniquely correct view, right? And so give up.
Oh, people do have it though. I'm sorry, they say it.
Yes, they absolutely do. And so, in the book, I try to make clear how often I've changed my own view. I spend my life thinking about ethics. It is my day job. It is my passion. And I'm constantly finding nuances and developing and being convinced by other thoughtful people who bring things to light. And what I really try to say to folks is, if we are talking about something, it matters, right? If we are having a discussion, the reason we're having it is because it matters. And if approximately half the country thinks that you are deeply wrong, it would be strange if there was nothing at all that undergirded their belief, right? It would be strange if it was just a strict form of irrationality. And what that means is, even on things that we have the deepest disagreement, there is probably something that we can identify that is an insight in the view that our interlocutor or that our opponent holds. So I really try to get people to search for those insights, to search for those shared starting points, to see the other people that they're talking about not as evil or bad or deeply, fallen, but instead as, folks that are just starting from a different place.
Right. Well, that is a form of radical humility. I like that. And perhaps you had talked about your own evolving sense of how you perceive ethics. You suffered a motorcycle accident, and as a result, had to use opioids to deal with pain. And there were some challenges to that. So how has that formed where you were then and how you are now, Travis? So.
This was the topic of the first book, and so
pain, right?
In pain, exactly, yeah. And so what happened is I had this pretty terrible motorcycle accident. I almost lost my left foot. I had 6 surgeries to reconstruct it, and the result of that sort of long reconstruction process is just months of around the clock opioid pain medication. At the time, this is back in 2015. I didn't have any real knowledge about pain medication or opioids or how they work. I didn't even really have a good sense of the developing drug overdose epidemic, which now I think you'd have to be living under a rock not to know something about. But back then, it was not quite as obvious to everyone. So what happened is I ended up being put on these medications for just far too long at far too high a dose. And then when I was told to get off, I didn't have any physician guide. I didn't have anyone to help me get off these medications. And it turns out they're deeply, deeply difficult to wean yourself off of. They have severe withdrawal syndromes. And so the thing that sparked that research program in that first book was a month-long, protracted, severe withdrawal syndrome from opioids. So I lived in hell for a month, and I survived, which kind of feels like a miracle. But at the end of it, I had this very different perspective on our healthcare system and on what I had gone through. So yeah, most of the stuff I had been working on in my research life before that accident was more related to this new book. It was largely about climate change and food and nutrition policy and big structural problems. And I actually just put everything on hold for about a year. And I just learned everything I could about addiction medicine and pain medicine, about the drugs, about America's opioid overdose, about the epidemiology of the crisis. And I just really humbled myself and just said, okay, I'm a beginner again. I need to learn about this. And I did discover some really interesting things coming at it as a beginner, as an outsider. And so that's what that other research program has been about.
Right. Well, I was thinking about, as you are a moral philosopher, a bioethicist, and so you're used, and as the book Catastrophe Ethics focuses on, its big issues. But when you're in the throes of a dependency, especially one that was prescribed, you get the thing is, does it really matter? And so from that, is there a conclusion that you drew that yes, it does matter, or what's your perspective on that, Travis? So.
On whether the ethics matters, or
Yes, I mean, I'm not. Yes, of course it does, but I think that moral philosophy is dealing with the big questions. But I think that's maybe the beauty of your book, Catastrophe Ethics. Yes, it's the big questions, but what do I do about it? And did I sum that up? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. So being a moral philosopher is sort of an interesting way to approach the world, because everything is interesting, right? And so the hell that I went through with,
well, so you would be a good cocktail party guest.
Exactly. Yeah, perhaps dark, but interested in everything. But yeah, the struggle with opioids was terrible when I went through it, but afterwards it was really quite fascinating. There were so many problems, and there were so many things to learn about my mind and about my body and about pain and the way pain works. So the catastrophe ethics material is similar in a way. There's something deeply distressing about the modern world. And the feature that is so distressing me is that most of the things we do in our lives make us a participant in something awful. And when I say most, I really do mean most, right? Right now, we're talking over electronic connection. We're using energy. That energy is costing carbon emissions, which are slowly contributing to warming the planet and catastrophe, right? I'm raising a child. Almost every part of raising a child is energy intensive, right? And then we all carry these things around like smartphones, anything with a lithium ion battery in it, involves us in a really problematic supply chain. So these batteries are made largely out of cobalt. Cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's mined under basically slave conditions, right? So we get involved in terrible agricultural systems very often. We use energy, we contribute to environmental degradation. We use electronics, we're involved in slavery overseas. It goes on and on and on. And that problem, that it sure feels like when I find out that something I'm doing involves me in something as terrible as slavery, it sure feels like the moral response is, well, then get yourself not involved. But when it comes to cobalt, for instance, it's not a realistic option. In the modern world, you can, but it's not realistically. You pragmatically can't opt out of electronics, opt out of rechargeable batteries. And so instead, entire systems, global systems have to change. And you can't do that, and I can't do that, and even we can't do it, and even we with all the listeners can't do it. It takes millions or billions of people along with system structures and politicians. So the thing that I found really interesting was this question: can I still be a decent person? I have to use a cell phone. I have to eat. I have to use energy to raise my daughter. Can I still be morally good? And I think the answer is yes, but it's not easy to see how. And that's the thing that really hooked me.
Right. Well, I think you do provide some solutions to the puzzle. You have something called the Moral Toolkit. Could you tell us about that, and perhaps an example or two?
Sure. So the Moral Toolkit is a little bit in response to that Mark Timmons quote that you brought up earlier. If we were just being a philosopher, we just go figure out that utilitarianism or whatever is correct and apply it. And the moral toolkit says, no, instead, as we work together, let's identify concepts or tools that are useful. So I think most reasonable people think it's important that we can talk about human rights. Most reasonable people think it's important that we talk about promoting the good and not causing egregious harm to others, et cetera, et cetera. So when we identify these concepts, we grab them and we sort of store them away. And that becomes part of our moral toolkit. One of the things that's interesting about this modern world that I was describing, where we get sucked up and implicated in these massive harmful structures, is that the toolkit we've developed over basically the whole history of humanity, hasn't equipped us to really deal with that problem, because we very often talk in terms of, are you causing harm? But our little conversation right here isn't creating enough emissions to cause any harm, right? Are you violating any rights? Our little conversation here isn't violating any rights, right? And so the thing that we have to add to our toolkit, I think, is we need to start talking about participation in structures, participation in systems. And so this is, big spoiler alert, but kind of going through all the steps along the way. One of the things that I want to say is, I was taught by my mom a long time ago, be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And that advice is really sound for all the schoolyard, issues, but it's still pretty sound even when our part is really tiny, right? And so that's what I want people to start identify is, what are the ways in which you can become part of a solution? Which are the ways in which you can stop being part of the problem? And we can't always, right? Because I still have my cell phone. It still uses cobalt. I'm still part of the problem. Right. But there are some ways that I can stop, and that's important to identify.
So it's making the moral choices that you can act and follow through on. And basically, it's do your best. And as you were saying this, and I'm looking at the world now with our polarity in politics and throughout the world, and also climate change, which is certainly existential, and so many other issues that divide us, and we don't have it. And then I think back to something, looking through rose-colored glasses, something as the rise of fascism in the 30s, and then of course it led to World War II. And we always say, well, that was a clear goal there, But there was the eradication of fascism, but it wasn't an overnight situation, and it never was really solved. So it's kind of, we're sort of living with problems. That's part of the human condition, is it not? So.
Yeah, 100%. So it's living with problems, finding ways to continue to exist even when we can't solve them, but not becoming nihilist about it, right? That's the other half. So you could just live with problems by throwing up your hands and saying, not my job, I don't have to care, right? And if all citizens of the world that were fighting the Nazis, right, threw up their hands and said, not our problem, we don't have to deal with it, that wouldn't have ended very well. So yes, no one of the folks who were like working back home to, fill in the munitions factory, no one of them could win the war for the Allies, but all of them were able to sort of identify the thing they could do to do their part, right? So that's the resisting nihilism is the part that makes it not just a sort of conscience balm, basically.
Right. As you were talking, I was thinking about the concept of bias, which colors our view of diversity and inclusion and equity. And the problem is that, or not the problem, but when you speak of radical humility, it's acknowledging that my own limitations, my own point of view, my own perspective. Is it not, Travis? So,
yeah. 100%. Yeah. So all of us are coming from our subjective experience, right? All of us are coming from our own place. And so, yes, one, radical humility is recognizing that it would take a sort of obscene level of hubris to think that I've gotten it right. But also to acknowledge that I'm one person with a very particular background, raised in a very particular way, exposed to very particular things, and nobody else in the world has had exactly that cocktail of ingredients, right? 100%.
But at the same time, you are the moral philosopher to ask on this, and there are certain moral truths which are universal. Is that too pie in the sky, or what is your perspective on that? So
100%. I believe there are true moral universals. I think I can prove it to you right now. It is wrong to light babies on fire for fun. Boom. Okay. You found a true moral universal. Do you agree? Is it wrong to light babies on fire for fun?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. See, we agree. All right thinking people agree. That one is true. Now it's a silly example, but that's kind of the point. There are things that we can agree on because we think there are moral facts. and the moral fact is causing egregious harm to an innocent person for no good reason is wrong. And then all of the stuff that we disagree on is details in a way. So it's going back to that radical humility, thinking about how confident am I that, we all got this set of things right. And now I think we got this other set of things right, but it's a little bit more complicated over here. So let's talk through it.
Well, there's two examples certainly in my lifetime, and that's I would say women's rights and rights of LGBTQ. At a certain point, when I was getting into the workforce, women were very definitely the second-class citizens, and it was kind of assumed. Well, I like to think of my wife as that first generation of women in management who led and did it great and changed people's perspective. I think the same thing with LGBTQ. We had our own biases, but then when we were educated and exposed and had interaction, our perspective changed. And can that be part of a moral toolkit? So
100%. Yeah. So sometimes moral philosophers have a hard time figuring out what to do with the idea of moral progress. So like what happens when we all or most or a large proportion of us change our views? So when we came to view slavery as obviously and clearly wrong, you go back to different points in time in different cultures, obviously that view wasn't shared. So yeah, in the case of both women's rights and LGBTQ, a couple of things happen. So one, I think most people actually shared the core belief underlying both of those advances, which is that all people are morally equal and equally worthy of respect. So the dignity inherent of people is not dependent on different features. And then the other part that's a little bit more specific is that first claim isn't diminished by sex or gender or by sexual orientation, by trans identity, by any of these other things, right? And so I think most people would have said like, yeah, being a human is morally special, but prior to sort of full women's emancipation, I think most men actually thought fully human was something like landowning men or something like this.
Oh yeah.
And so what we started to realize is that's a nonsense distinction. There's absolutely zero reason to think about one person's gender as actually reflecting on their moral worthiness. And the same thing is true about sexual orientation, trans identity, et cetera. So yeah, we keep expanding the moral circle because we identify things that we were wrong to think they mattered.
Right. Well, I could keep on going, but I know you have a busy schedule, and I want to wrap it up. And as you know, I ask every question. I ask every question. I ask a few questions. I ask every guest to tell us a story about grace. Do you have something you'd like to share with us, Travis? So.
Yeah, I already sort of gave you all the preview when I talked about this motorcycle accident I had back in 2015. But one of the things that most stayed with me after that experience was the way in which I had never encountered really serious life-limiting, life-changing hardship. And I wasn't sort of emotionally prepared for how many people cared about me and for me and were willing to just radically change their lives to work around me. And so this went from my bosses, I had this brand new faculty position at Johns Hopkins, and my bosses, like the big bosses, the famous people who I didn't know very well yet, called my cell phone once I was conscious in the hospital and said, your job is safe, your work will be here, heal, right? Do what you need to do. And we had a 1.5-year-old baby at home, and all these people who loved us and who cared for us just changed their lives to help raise our kid while my wife was trying to like hold her life together while I was in the hospital. Just the number of people who did all of this. And then most particularly my partner, Sadia, who just nursed me back to health for months and into years. I don't wish on anyone that they go through trauma, but I sort of wish on everyone that they learn how many people care for and about them. It was really revolutionary for me.
What a beautiful story. And it's so multifaceted. I can imagine there was a transformative process of grace that helped you heal. And then, but it was the I'll say that respectfully, little things that people did, that what your bosses told you just saying the job is safe. What an act of grace to say that. So,
Yeah.
Great. Well, this has been a wonderful thing. Travis, where can we find the book, and how do we find you? So,
book can be found basically any good bookseller. Happy for you to support independent booksellers. And I have a website, travisrieder.com. I'm easy to find on the web. I've written a little excerpt for Time Magazine if you want to get a taste of it. Folks can reach out if they want.
We will put those notes in there, and the name of the book is Catastrophe Ethics, and it is a good read, and it will not depress you. It will enlighten you and challenge you. So with that, we're going to go out. So